This is chapter 25 of Pride and Prejudice, or chapter 2 of volume 2 of Pride and Prejudice. After a week spent in professions of love and schemes of felicity, Mr. Collins was called from his amiable Charlotte by the arrival of Saturday. The pain of separation, however, might be alleviated on his side by preparations for the reception of his bride, and he had reason to hope that shortly after his next return into Hertfordshire, the day would be fixed that was to make him the happiest of men. He took leave of his relations at Longbourn with as much solemnity as before, wished his fair cousins health and happiness again, and promised their father another letter of thanks. It's weird to tell someone, I'm gonna write you a thank you, but as we know, Mr. Collins is a bit strange. On the following Monday, Mrs. Bennet had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, who came as usual to spend the Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sister, as well by nature as education. The Netherfield ladies would have difficulty in believing that a man who lived by trade, and within view of his own warehouses, could have been so well bred and agreeable. Mrs. Gardner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was an amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favorite with all her Longbourn nieces. Between the two eldest and herself especially, there subsisted a very particular regard. They had frequently been staying with her in town. So Mrs. Gardner is Elizabeth and Jane's aunt by marriage. Mrs. Bennet's brother, Mr. Gardner, is a respectable person. He earns his own living, though, so people like Caroline Bingley would look down at him, but they would be surprised, people who are so snobby as to believe that earning your own money is something that makes you lesser than others. They would be surprised that he is so well-mannered and polite. He's good people, and so is Mrs. Gardner, and she gets along very well with Jane and Elizabeth. The first part of Mrs. Gardner's business on her arrival was to distribute her presents and describe the newest fashions. When this was done, she had a less active part to play. It became her turn to listen. Mrs. Bennet had many grievances to relate and much to complain of. They had all been very ill-used since she last saw her sister. 2 of her girls had been on the point of marriage, and after all, there was nothing in it. I do not blame Jane, she continued, for Jane would have got Mr. Bingley if she could. But Lizzie, oh sister, it is very hard to think that she might have been Mr. Collins' wife by this time, had it not been for her own perverseness. He made her an offer in this very room, and she refused him. The consequence of it is that Lady Lucas will have a daughter married before I have, and that Longbourn estate is just as much entailed as ever. The Lucases are very artful people indeed, sister. They are all for what they can get. I am sorry to say it of them, but so it is. It makes me very nervous and poorly to be thwarted so in my own family, and to have neighbors who think of themselves before anybody else. However, your coming just this time is the greatest of comforts, and I am glad to hear what you tell us of long sleeves. I love how Mrs. Bennet just jumps around from how everyone has wronged her to long sleeves being in right now. Mrs. Gardner, to whom the chief of this news had been given before, in the course of Jane and Elizabeth's correspondence with her, made her sister a slight answer, and in compassion to her nieces turned the conversation. So here we see an example of Mrs. Gardner being a good person, and probably why, in part, she's so well liked by Elizabeth and Jane. She can tell that they're upset by Mrs. Bennet going on and on about these marriages that didn't happen, and she switches the conversation. So wise move, Mrs. Gardner. Correspondence, by the way, just means letter writing, and you'll notice that there are quite a lot of letters in Pride and Prejudice which contain key information and show us a lot about the authors and sometimes the characters who receive them. So Caroline Bingley's letters to Jane have been one of the key correspondences so far in the novel. When alone with Elizabeth afterwards, she spoke more on the subject. It seems likely to have been a desirable match for Jane, said she. I am sorry it went off, but these things happen so often. A young man, such as you describe Mr. Bingley, so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks, and when accident separates them, so easily forgets her, that these sort of inconsistencies are very frequent. An excellent consolation in its way, said Elizabeth, but it will not do for us. We do not suffer by accident. It does not often happen that the interference of friends will persuade a young man of independent fortune to think no more of a girl whom he was violently in love with only a few days before. So Mrs. Gardner's trying to comfort her and say, oh, it happens a lot that just these men are just flighty and they get away from a girl they really like and then the affection is just gone. And Elizabeth says that's a load of baloney. His sister and his friend contrived to take him away from Jane, and he was really in love with her. But that expression of violently in love is so hackneyed, so doubtful, so indefinite, that it gives me very little idea. It is as often applied to feelings which arise only from a half-hour's acquaintance as to a real strong attachment. Pray, how violent was Mr. Bingley's love? So Mrs. Gardner says, hey, listen, sometimes you just people just get really attracted to someone and they think they're violently in love. It doesn't always mean that there was genuine love growing. I never saw a more promising inclination. He was growing quite inattentive to other people, and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met, it was more decided and remarkable. At his own ball, he offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking them to dance, and I spoke to him twice myself without receiving an answer. Could these be finer symptoms? Is not general incivility the very essence of love? So Elizabeth says he was so distracted by Jane that he was even rude. Isn't that sort of rudeness a sign of being really in love? Oh yes, of that kind of love which I supposed him to have felt. Poor Jane, I am sorry for her, because with her disposition she may not get over it immediately. It had better have happened to you, Lizzie. You would have laughed yourself out of it sooner. But do you think she would be prevailed on to go back with us? Change of scene might be of service, and perhaps a little relief from home may be as useful as anything. Elizabeth was exceedingly pleased with this proposal, and felt persuaded of her sister's ready acquiescence. So Mrs. Gardner says maybe she wants to get out of Longbourn for a while and come with us, spend some time with us. Frequent visits that lasted longer than our typical visits nowadays were very common in Regency era England. Mr. Collins comes to stay about 2 weeks with the Bennets. Mr. Darcy is kind of staying indefinitely at Netherfield. In the early section of the novel. Travel was very difficult. It took you much longer to get anywhere by horse or by coach and carriage than it would take now with cars and planes and our modern transportation. So it was much more common for people to stay with relatives and friends for longer periods of time. So that's what Mrs. Gardner is suggesting, and Jane thinks that her sister would readily acquiesce, so that she would agree quickly. I hope, added Mrs. Gardner, that no consideration with regard to this young man will influence her. We live in so different a part of town, all our connections are so different, and as you well know, we go out so little that it is very improbable they shouldn't get at all, unless he really comes to see her. So Mrs. Gardner says, we do live in London, Bingley's in London, but we don't really know anyone, we're not in the same part of town, so they probably won't run into each other. Do you think that that will stop Jane from coming? And that is quite impossible, for he is now in the custody of his friend, and Mr. Darcy would no more suffer him to call on Jane in such a part of London. My dear aunt, how would you think of it? Mr. Darcy may perhaps have heard of such a place as Gracechurch Street, but he would hardly think a month's ablution enough to cleanse him from its impurities, were he once to enter it. And depend upon it, Mr. Bingley never stirs without him. So Elizabeth says, I don't think that Mr. Darcy would ever come to that part of London. Gracechurch Street was considered sort of a upper middle class area, and if Darcy and Bingley are more wealthy, Darcy wouldn't want to go around there, apparently. And Elizabeth says Bingley just follows whatever Darcy does, so he's probably not going to pop up there. So much the better. I hope they will not meet at all. But does not Jane correspond with his sister? She will not be able to help calling. She will drop the acquaintance entirely. But in spite of the certainty in which Elizabeth affected to place this point, as well as the still more interesting one of Bingley's being withheld from seeing Jane, she felt a solicitude on the subject which convinced her on examination that she did not consider it entirely hopeless. It was possible, and sometimes she thought it probable, that his affection might be reanimated, and the influence of his friends successfully combated by the more natural influence of Jane's attractions. So Elizabeth is still kind of thinking maybe there is hope for Jane and Bingley. Maybe Bingley can get out of the total influence of Mr. Darcy and his sisters. Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure, and the Bingleys were no otherwise in her thoughts at the same time than as she hoped, by Caroline's not living in the same house with her brother. She might occasionally spend a morning with her, without any danger of seeing him. The Gardners stayed a week at Longbourn, and what with the Phillipses, the Lucases, and the officers, there was not a day without its engagement. Mrs. Bennet had so carefully provided for the entertainment of her brother and sister that they did not once sit down to a family dinner. Oh, just a little side note, Jane Austen uses the word engagement. There's not a day without its engagement. She doesn't mean like, will you marry me engagement. She means engagement as in a thing to do, an event to go to. When the engagement was for home, some of the officers always made part of it, of which officers Mr. Wickham was sure to be one. And on these occasions Mrs. Gardner, rendered suspicious by Elizabeth's warm commendation of him, narrowly observed them both. Without supposing them, from what she saw, to be very seriously in love, their preference of each other was plain enough to make her a little uneasy, and she resolved to speak to Elizabeth on the subject before she left Hertfordshire, and represent to her the imprudence of encouraging such an attachment. So Mrs. Gardner watches Elizabeth and Wickham talk, and although she doesn't think that they're seriously in love, she does notice that they always sit together, that they seem to be kind of flirting a lot, that there is an attraction growing there. To Mrs. Gardner, Wickham had one means of affording pleasure, unconnected with his general powers. About 10 or a dozen years ago, before her marriage, she had spent a considerable time in that very part of Derbyshire to which he belonged. They had therefore many acquaintance in common, and though Wickham had been little there since the death of Darcy's father 5 years before, it was yet in his power to give her fresher intelligence of her former friends than she had been in the way of procuring. So Mrs. Gardner used to live in Derbyshire where Wickham lived and where Darcy lived also, and they used to have some sort of mutual acquaintances. So she kind of knows him a little bit, and she wants to hear about some of these people. Mrs. Gardner had seen Pemberley and known the late Mr. Darcy by character perfectly well. Here, consequently, was an inexhaustible subject of discourse. In comparing her recollection of Pemberley with the minute description which Wickham could give, and in bestowing her praise on the character of his late possessor, she was delighting both him and herself. So they're both talking about Mr. Darcy Sr., our Mr. Darcy, Fitzwilliam Darcy's father, and they're both talking about how great a guy he was. So again, we have confirmation that Mr. Darcy Sr. was a good guy, very well respected and well liked. On being made acquainted with the present Mr. Darcy's treatment of him, she tried to remember something of that gentleman's reputed disposition, when quite a lad, which might agree with it, and was confident at last that she recollected having heard Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy formerly spoken of as a very proud, ill-natured boy. So again, Mrs. Gardner also has heard of our Mr. Darcy and does remember that he was a proud, ill-natured child. And that is the end of chapter 25, or chapter 2 of volume 2 of Pride and Prejudice.